everybody, my name's Chloe Savage and I'm also joined by Rachel today. We'll be presenting this talk on sensory differences in the classroom. So just a little bit about us to begin with. So again, my name's Chloe Savage. Currently, I am an assistant psychologist at the Witherslack group. I did originally do a degree in psychology with counselling, and then I did a further 2 years as an assistant head of year at a secondary school working with all ages 11 to 16. I was of pastoral in this role, and then I did 2 years as a head of year 7 and worked in primary to secondary transitions. Most of the work I did was with students with additional needs, particularly those with social, emotional, mental health needs. And then I moved on to be a research assistant within the field of psychology before working where I am now at Witherslack Group.
And I'm Rachel, and I'm an occupational therapy apprentice at the minute, which I've just started. And then I also had my undergraduate in psychology, and before that I've worked in like mental health. So yeah.
All right, so we're just going to start with a little bit of background theory about sensory differences, and then after that we'll move on to some strategies that you can put into place in the classroom.
So there is 8 different sensory systems, and obviously when we're like at school and stuff, you usually only hear about 5 of those. So that's obviously like your taste, your touch, your smell, hearing, vision. But there is actually another 3, which are vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoception, which obviously people might not have heard of before.
We'll talk a little bit more about what they are.
Yeah. So vestibular, this is a sense that controls as movement and as balance. As one of the OTs described it, it helps us to stay upright. So someone who's got sensory differences in this area, they might appear to be quite unsteady on the feet, or they might seek the vestibular feedback out by spinning. Proprioceptive sense, this is body awareness sense. It kind of helps us to know where we are. And differences with this sense, they might be like people might bang into things. They might, so when you're handwriting, they might put loads and loads of sort of force on the pencil or not enough force for it to write. And also like chewing, that can be a sensory proprioceptive difference. And then finally there's interoception. So this is your internal body sense, and it helps us to understand and recognize what does internal signals mean. So someone who has like needs with this sense, they might not know when they're hungry, or they might eat because they just don't know when they're full. And then in regards to emotions, it might look like someone who just gets angry like that, but actually they've just not been able to feel the signs in the body, like the clenched fists, the heating, like rising and becoming a little bit less relaxed.
Okay, perfect. So Rachel's just covered them extra 3 senses there, the ones that we don't talk about too much. Obviously, we do know a lot about sight and sound and touch, the other ones, but they're the 3 extra, and we will talk a little bit more about them today, because they are actually senses that a lot of students have differences with, but we don't easily recognise them as much. So I just want to move on to the main types of sensory differences now. So obviously we just covered the senses themselves, the 5 that we know about already, and the 3 that we don't talk about as much. So now I just want to cover the different types of essentially how these sensory systems can be affected. So the main way in which, well, one of the main ways in which the sensory systems can be affected is through hypersensitivity. So what that is it's an oversensitivity. So it's where somebody may experience a really strong reaction to this sensory system. So they may feel overloaded. So something to us that might not feel too overwhelming in terms of our senses can be really, really overwhelming to them, and can cause anxiety, it can cause stress, and it can even cause actual pain for somebody if it's that overbearing and overwhelming. So a person with hypersensitivity, this oversensitivity to one of the sensory systems, may avoid environments with strong sensory inputs in these environments. So just to give you a couple of examples now, if you think about your classrooms, I'm sure there's lots and lots of noise that happens in there. It could be the little things, so it could be pencils as they move across the paper, or it could be pencils tapping on tables or pens tapping on tables, clocks ticking, students chatting in group discussions or as they're working. There could be all sorts going on in that classroom. So somebody who is hypersensitive, so oversensitive, may feel really, really overwhelmed by them sounds. Especially if they're in combination together, the sensory system might be really, really overwhelmed. And that again can lead to people shutting down, avoiding that environment, struggling to engage in work. Another really common one that we see in schools in terms of hypersensitivity is to the touch system. We are very aware that especially in mainstream schools, there's uniforms that are in place, so often blazers, jumpers, shirts, and students often with sensory differences can have a problem with wearing these textures. Again, that sensory system might feel overloaded by certain textures. If we think of now certain lessons that might be affected by or might be affected in terms of if a student has sensory differences in the touch area, we can think about PE, because there's lots of physical contact involved in PE, or at least sometimes. We might think about art, where they're expected to touch different materials. We could even talk about things like textiles or any subject, food technology, where there's lots of textures and different feelings involved. To someone who's hypersensitive, that might really overwhelm their sensory system. And lastly, just as an example, I'll touch on chairs. So in your classrooms, if students are very oversensitive, hypersensitive to the touch system, the sensory system that is responsive to touch, even the seating might overwhelm them if it's a texture that they're overwhelmed by, essentially. So that is one type, as in terms of hypersensitivity. The thing I just wanted to touch on before we move on is hyposensitivity. So very opposite to being overwhelmed is the sensation of being underwhelmed. So that's hypersensitivity, and that's where a person has reduced response to sensory input. So what might stimulate us doesn't necessarily stimulate somebody else. So in this case, they may seek out more intense sensory input. So somebody who's, for example, sound, their hearing system is hyposensitive, they might look at putting things on really loud volume because they need that extra sensory input to be stimulated. Or alternatively, you might see someone whose sounds or hearing system is hyposensitive. You might find that they need louder instructions when you're talking to them for them to be responsive. But we do have other examples. This can be in any system. Someone can be hyposensitive. So we might have touch. Someone might not have a reduced response to touch or to pressure, and in which case that student might be looking to seek deep pressure a lot. So they might be looking to engage in physical contact with students a lot. And they might push against things a lot physically, or push hard down on the tables or against the chairs. And another sign of this, actually, which is interesting, is that they might be unaware of pain in a way that we'd expect. So if they cut themselves or fall over, they might not react to that in a way that you would expect. And that might suggest that they're hypersensitive in that touch system, or the system that senses the body. Okay, so we'll move on. So just quickly, I wanted to touch on sensory differences and how they're linked to autism. So I think we could probably, a lot of us agree that we think of autism when we think of sensory differences. And that makes complete sense, because actually I did some research and looked at different literature and reviews in the research areas, and it showed that about 90% of autistic people experience some form of sensory differences. And that makes complete sense, because sensory differences is actually part of the diagnostic criteria for autism. But it's just worth us thinking about why. And some of the reasons why that could be is because the brain, essentially, the brain structures in neurodiversity and autism specifically are different, or can be very different, to the brain structures of people without autism. And this can have all sorts of effects. It can affect how people with autism or autistic people receive sound. It can affect how not just sound, sorry, the senses. It can affect where the signals are sent in the brain, and it can also have cause difficulties with filtering out information, so making it hard to focus in on certain elements of the senses, which can make someone feel really overwhelmed. When we think of someone with autism or an autistic person, what we might think of is, for example, them covering their ears or becoming agitated when they hear a lot of noise or when they're in a busy environment. We might also think of them struggling to cope with bright flickering lights, or seeking out dimmer environments, or wearing sunglasses indoors. And they're all examples of hypersensitivity in autistic people. They're all also are examples of hyposensitivity in autistic people. So that's the opposite again. And this is, again, we talked about this a little bit before, so that might be where they don't seem to experience pain in response to an injury as much. There might be other examples, so they might go out of their way to make loud noises, or you might see a presentation of a lot of loud noise, or flapping the hands, or some stimming behaviours, and that might be seeking sensory input. So that's another example of hyposensitivity in autism. But just to cover that, it's not just autism that we can relate to sensory differences. It goes much beyond that spectrum and that diagnosis. We can also think about ADHD, for example, and the research shows that around 60 to 70% of people with ADHD experience sensory differences. We often might jump to thinking about how people with ADHD are often sensory seeking, so craving stimulation. So that would suggest that their systems are hyposensitive, so they are looking for more sensory input. So we can think about fidgeting, tapping feet, being on the move all the time, speaking at fast pace, and they're looking for more sensory input. But people with ADHD are often also hypersensitive as well, so where they get sensory overload, not always, but often. And examples of this might be, they might be overwhelmed, similar to what we've just described when we talked about autism. They might be overwhelmed by sounds, by lights, by textures, by smells, a whole combination of things. And what that can do is, if they are hypersensitive and they're overwhelmed by the senses, it can make it really hard for them to concentrate and for them to focus on work in school, social interactions, anything that's going on for them, which is already can be a very difficult task for somebody who has ADHD. Last little bit from me, and this is something I wanted to touch on because it's not something we really cover very much at the moment, and that's sensory differences beyond a diagnosis. So what that means is looking past just diagnosed, for example, autism or ADHD or other things like sensory processing disorder or other types of neurodivergence. And I particularly wanted to zone in on childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. That is an area at the Witherslack group we work a lot with, and we wanted to bring some light to that today. So children with trauma often also experience significant sensory differences, and I did a bit of a pool of the research, and what we found is that there's between 50 and 70% of young people that are apparently experiencing sensory differences, which is absolutely massive, and they're not always obvious. And I think it's really important that we consider that when we're thinking about our children in the classroom, because there could be somebody without a diagnosis there that is experiencing sensory differences just as much, or is having just as big of an impact as somebody who has got them special educational needs that are diagnosed, or there's a plan in place for them already. You might be wondering why that happens, and I definitely did when I started working with children who had experienced childhood trauma. Essentially, children with trauma histories are often more likely to develop hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, as our brains these systems, the sensory systems, they develop in interaction with our environments. They don't, our brains don't grow in a vacuum. So everything that happens to us as children is having the potential to impact the way our brain develops. And for children who have had ongoing repeated exposure to traumatic events, that's likely to have a big impact in the way these sensory systems have developed in the brain, and changed part of that brain structure. So just like other students with diagnosed conditions, children with childhood trauma can absolutely have differences in their sensory systems in the brain, and that changes the way that they receive sensory input and the way that they react to that sensory input. And just secondly, another thing that I really wanted to highlight is a bit of a discussion on also something that we call the fight, flight or freeze response. So the fight, flight or freeze response is essentially something that keeps us safe. So if in everyday life we run into something that it puts us in danger, so for example, we're being chased down the street, or all of a sudden we're cooking and our pan's on fire, our body does react because we're in danger, and it reacts by going into one of these three survival modes. Essentially, it goes into fight, which is preparing to fight something or challenge it or resolve a conflict, whatever that may be. It can go into flight, which is where we run away, or we avoid the situation, or we can go into freeze, which is essentially where we shut down, and that's a survival response, because our body is telling us if we do nothing, if we freeze, we will survive. Now, children with trauma, they tend to, not always, but tend to have really heightened fight, flight, freeze response systems. So the pathways in the brain and the neural networks that are set up to activate these fight, flight, freeze responses are much more easily stimulated. And that is also something that can cause these sensory differences. So, for example, a child in the classroom might become really easily triggered to something that we don't see as dangerous. So if we find a flickering of light, we might not see that as dangerous. But to someone who is much easily pushed into the fight, flight or freeze responses, the flickering of light can trigger that response. And the next thing you know, for example, they're in flight. So they're avoiding it, they're running away, or they might be in freeze. So sensory differences tie into this fight, flight or freeze, because this sensory input can make a child go into that fight, flight or freeze, because they interpret that sensory input as danger. They interpret that sensory input as something to run away from, or to fight, or to freeze from, because everything feels dangerous in a world to a child where they've had danger throughout their life. Some examples of how the sensory input may affect someone who has experienced childhood trauma or adverse experiences is a child may react strongly to flickering lights. I think I discussed that just now. Alarms, loud noises, crowded places, but even much more subtle things like a ticking clock. If there's a lot of different smaller sounds going on at once, again, a child may, or their body or their brain may misinterpret these signs as a danger, and that may put them into that fight, flight or freeze response. Another example is strong smells or bright lights, and any of these senses can also may cause the sensory system to overreact, because they also may be linked to past traumatic experiences. So the child's brain can associate even neutral things with a feeling of threat or fear that they've felt in the past, if there's some relation between that sensory input and something that happened to them previously. Just wanted to talk about hyposensitivity again, so that undersensitivity and how that may occur in childhood, or children who have experienced trauma in the childhood. So we may find that children who have experienced trauma are constantly on the move. They may jump around or fidget a lot. They may be rocking in the seat or look for that rocking sensation. And this often happens because trauma can cause the brain to be less responsive to sensory input, as well as being as we just discussed, as well as being over responsive to it. Again, that's just due to them brain differences that develop based on what's happened to them in their lives. And as a result, the child may seek out physical movement or sensory input that their brain is not processing enough of its own. Again, we've discussed this a lot in other examples, but a child who's experienced childhood trauma may not react to pain or temperature change just as much as we would imagine them to. And again, this can be related to an underwhelmed sensory system. I think the takeaway from this today is just to raise a little bit of awareness on the fact that children with adverse experiences and trauma really do have differences, or can have differences in their sensory systems, and this may come across when we see them in the classroom. They may present similar to someone who has a diagnosis of, for example, ADHD or autism, and it could be that there's an overlap and there's a combination of diagnoses or things that have happened to them that have resulted in their presentation. But sensory differences are very much a part of, or can be very much a part of the aftermath of childhood trauma. So just want to move on now. So I know you're all keen to probably know some strategies and things we can do. I know I've done a lot of talking about theory, but I am in psychology and that's kind of our thing, so apologies. So just to move on now to provision and what we can do. So we're going to start with talking about universal provision. So that's something as teachers, as classroom assistants, as people working in school, you can do for everyone in the classroom. And then we'll move on to the next levels of what you can do if that doesn't work. So, Rach, I'll hand over to you.
So at the school that we work at, one of the things that we do to try and help with the universal provisions is an audit tool, which is evidence-based from the, I can't remember the name now.
Environments, capable environments,
that's
framework.
But basically it touches on different areas, different senses. So I'll just give you a few examples. So for like the visual, so generally we try and make it so it was like reduced visual stimulus, and then the more personalized things would be for people who are more like hypersensitive.
Yeah.
So visual, so generally we can try and keep classrooms quite tidy and free from clutter where we can. Obviously places get messy throughout the day, but just trying to keep like kids' desks tidied, having like clear labels on things so we know where things are, so it sort of takes away a bit of stress in that sense. When we're having us teaching areas at the front, try and keep that free from like displays and things, and just have your content that you're teaching, because then it helps the kids to focus on what they need to be focusing on at the time. And also like having things like varied lighting where we can. So obviously sometimes the big lights in rooms can flicker, and like we might not even notice that they're flickering, but other people might. So it's good to try and check those and have like natural light, low level lighting that people can choose from. Another thing for auditory, so like your noise levels, we can try and keep that to a minimum by having like the door closed where we can to the classroom to reduce outside noise. We can also have ear defenders available for kids to pick up, and again having those clearly labelled drawers where the ear defenders are so they know where they are to get them before they start to get stressed. For tactile sensors, having the temperature at like a good, like comfortable temperature. So like opening windows when we can, if it's not too noisy outside, obviously. And not having the radiators too high, because sometimes when people get hot, the clothes start to bother them a little bit more and things like that. And then for smells, something that we can do is avoid wearing really like strong smelling perfumes, because some people might find that really tricky. As well as keeping the door closed again where we can, because not only does that help with noise, but it also keeps smells from outside coming in. For like the taste sensors, there's not really anything we can do in the classrooms, but it's good to have like varied meals at meal times where we can, like sandwiches, jacket potatoes, your regular main meals, just so that people have got a choice who do struggle with taste. For ways that we can manage as other sensors that we mentioned, so your vestibular sensors, that can obviously be like rocking, so getting things like they're called Zuma rocker chairs, but they're basically just rocking chairs. Therapy balls, which look like yoga balls, and wobble cushions, which is actually something that you put on the chair and you can just wobble around on it. And also obviously the kids that like spinning, like sometimes you can get like spinny chairs which can either help or not help. It is really individualized. For your proprioceptive stuff, having things like weighted items, so like blankets, lap pads, You can get little like weighted animals off Amazon and stuff. And also doing like tasks like carrying books round or carrying backpacks round, which are heavy. That's helpful for a lot of kids. And that also helps with movement breaks as well. So movement breaks are quite a big thing that help with vestibular and proprioception stuff. And that can be done by walking around school or walking around the class, or even doing like little desk yoga activities. And another proprioceptive thing is you can get resistance bands that you put around the bottom of chairs where you can like wiggle your feet. And then for interoception, like this is quite hard to manage because obviously everyone's different. But just things like showing the kids where the toilets are, sort of like having reminders like, or if you're going somewhere, or do we need to use the toilet, or things like that, and having like a visual timetable which says when like breakfast times are, lunch times are, so that people who do struggle with knowing when they're hungry, they can sort of see where the routines are. So that helps for interoception, and also like emotional literacy. So if you see that someone's quite sweaty and they might be quite red, it might be helpful to just approach them and be like, I can see that you're quite sweaty. I'm wondering if you're hot. So do we want to go and sit next to a window, or do you need to go outside? And also for interoception, there's a thing called zones of regulation, which people might have heard of, but you can have displays where people can basically choose like which zone they're in, and that sort of helps to identify with some feelings that you might not have thought about before. So that's just some stuff that can help, which are in our audit, but also from the OTs and stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. So Rachel's just talked about the audit that we have in our school, and essentially all the things she just talked about and all the techniques that you can put in your or strategies you can put in place in your classroom. We essentially have a checklist where teachers can check against and see if they have access to them or they use them strategies in their classroom, and then we kind of have a reflection space where they can talk about how they can change their environment to better suit the needs of the children based on this audit. And the audit's really successful in school. It really gives teachers a time to think about, does my classroom best meet the universal needs of the students here? So we have also, just as you can see on the screen now, put up an example of another sensory assessment. This isn't the one we use in our school, but it is a nice basic introductory sensory assessment. And what we'd advise here is you could use this actual one, or you could use a similar, or use this as a starting point, and essentially walk through the space of your classroom or your school and look at it from a child's perspective and focus on the senses and how the sensory input will come across to the child from that perspective. So some of the things, again, similar to what Rachel just covered, that you might look at is look at the visual. So as you're walking around and you're doing this walk around your classroom or your space, look at what's on offer there. And as Rachel just talked about, think about your displays, think about the patterns, the lighting, the room organisation. And really what we're looking to do is reduce. So we're looking not to overstimulate our young people. Where possible, we want to really reduce that audio, visual noise and all the taste noises. When I say noise, I mean the busyness. We're looking to reduce that where possible. Same with smells. So walk around your space. What can you smell? What's popping up for you? And again, the same with taste. I mean, by all means, take a screenshot of this slide if you want. I've also put a link at the end of the presentation where you can access this as well. But essentially, this is just a little guide to how you can walk around your classroom and you can give it a bit of an audit yourself and think about how it looks and think about how it sounds, how it smells, how you hear it. And then you can start to make possible adjustments to that to reduce that sensory overload, which will be really helpful for everyone in the class, not just the hypersensitive students, but everybody. This is a second slide that completes the first slide here to make it a full audit. So again, you can take a screenshot, or I've put a link at the end to where you can access it, but it's just thinking about the different senses again, the tactile sense. So have we considered seating, so the types of seats that students are sat on, where they're sat in the classroom. So vestibular, that sense of balance, keeping us upright. Have we thought about movement breaks like Rachel's commented on? Have we thought about proprioception, so the use of movement kind of, and incorporating movement into the day and into the hour that you have them off, however long you're working with them. So yeah, that's a nice little tool. It just gets you thinking about your classroom. Is it doing what it needs to do to meet the sensory needs of the students in there? And this will benefit everybody in the classroom, whether they have sensory needs or not. So it's a really good place to start. Just a little bit on the incorporating heavy work into the day. So this is just some ideas of things you could do. Incorporating heavy, we say heavy, we're not saying anything crazy. But yeah, some physical work into the day will benefit all students. So these are just some examples. You're sweeping up, pushing or pulling boxes of toys out or putting them away. Or if you're in high school, that could be the same with books, putting books away, putting glue sticks away. Get that movement, standing up, putting something away. Can you ask them to hold doors open for the peers, hand out things? All of those are just little jobs and routines that you can integrate in and swap around amongst different students in your classroom, and incorporating that physical work into the classroom environment is really, really important. It keeps children regulated. Other activities we can do that is more of go out of your way to plan, but is really worth it, and will depend what level and age you're teaching. But throwing and catching activities, maybe you could put that into an academic lesson. Throw the beanbag to a student, and you know, they share a fact, for example, if obviously that's within the realms of what they're capable or willing to do. You could use crayons instead for colouring instead of felt tip pens. So switch up the textures, but you know, as long as you know that there's not a student who's particularly sensitive to that texture, and let them interact with that physically. Bouncing on things, so can you incorporate something that includes a bit of physical movement in that sense? Again, you can incorporate these things into academic tasks if we think a little bit about how we can do that. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about personalised provision now. So let's say you've done that universal example of doing the audit on the classroom, you've had a look at what your classroom or your environment has, and you've made some adjustments, really, you know, minimising that overwhelm on the senses. We can look at personalised provision. So that's where we start to consider students individually now. So again, this is a lot of information. We're not going to read through it all, but I just wanted to pop it on here. You can take a screenshot if you want, or again, I'll signpost where you can get this from at the end of the presentation. And this just essentially acts as a little bit of a gauge, a little bit of a tool for understanding individual students who have them or seemingly have them extra sensory needs. So let's say you've looked at your whole classroom and you've adapted the environment and you've adapted your routines, and there's still a student or a couple of students struggling in terms of the sensory needs. This is quite a good tool. So let's say that you notice a student seems to have differences with their hearing or their auditory. You can go to the box that says auditory, and you can kind of use this as a bit of a gauge to assess whether that is a problem for them and how it might be presenting. So for example, are they distressed by everyday noises? Are they covering their ears a lot? Are they easily distracted by noises that they aren't aware of? Do they hum to themselves? So there's some examples, and it just gives you a bit of a gauge of signs to look out for individual students who may seem to be struggling with a sense. The boxes above the little symbols that say tactile, taste, auditory. I'm pointing, but you can't see me pointing. So the boxes above the little icons, they are signs that someone is oversensitive. So hypersensitive. So it's a sign that the student's getting too much input in that area already, and that any additional thing is causing them some form of distress or inability to stay regulated. The boxes below them, little icons, are showing signs of an undersensitivity. So that's where they might need more input. So if we look at the auditory one again, We can say, for example, that they might not hear things or respond to their name. They might listen to loud TV or music, sorry. They might self-stimulate in terms of noise a lot, so make a lot of noises. So this profile here is just acts as a bit of a guide of signs to look out for, that a student might be oversensitive or undersensitive in different sensory areas. Once you know that about a student, one, it's really good to know. It can help form a bit of a sensory profile that you could possibly build. So that's why if you've got that one particular student who is struggling in terms of their sensory needs and the sensory needs are kind of I guess, having an effect on their learning and their social interaction and things, this sensory profile can be really useful. So it's basically putting what we've learned about that student and their sensory needs and using that last slide as a bit of a tool to build up an idea of who they are in terms of their senses and how they experience the senses and what the needs are. So there's a little box for each sense here. If we take an example, so this person is called Joel. And for the tactile sense, it puts about Joel that I can be resistant towards exploring new materials and textures. And that might be something that the teacher or teaching and learning assistant has assessed previously. And then it's got a little thing that they've noticed that does help them. So when introducing them to messy play, they like to first explore things through a clean wallet. So it's a little thing that's been noticed and a little thing that seems to help them. And you might not always know what helps that student yet, but even the awareness about the things that they are sensitive to or undersensitive to, and creating a bit of a sensory profile for your student that may be struggling is really, really helpful. And this can be shared with teachers, it can be shared with learning assistants, it can be shared with everyone in school, and even get parents and carers involved in that as well. They might know a lot about the child that's not presenting in school, but that might be helpful to know. And also similarly, if the child's at a level or age that they can contribute, that's amazing, because they will know themselves best.
Yeah, and it's always good to ask the child themselves, because like, to be fair, if they can identify it and they can identify things that will help them, then they are probably more likely to engage in those things that they've identified. And it can also like reduce that kind of demand as well. So it is always good to ask the kid where you can.
Another thing that might be useful for students who have that sensory need that goes beyond just being appeased by the universal kind of strategies we talked about is creating a sensory box or a sensory bag. We understand that might be more difficult in mainstream high school settings, but possibly even a sensory bag that they can carry around with them. It doesn't have to be something that a teacher always has. It could be something that's theirs that they take to different classrooms and that they're allowed to use. And in this example, again, we won't read it all, but you can take a screenshot or I can direct you to it at the end. There's just some ideas of how you can create a sensory box or a sensory bag for a young person who has sensory need. So again, we've got the different senses spanned across the page there, and above the icon, so for example, above the tactile icon, there's ideas that might calm a student. So if we find that they're really oversensitive, so they're really easily overwhelmed within one sense, these calming activities might be really good examples. If the opposite way, we find that they're hyposensitive, so they're undersensitive to one of the senses, the activities below the icons might be helpful. So again, if we look at let's look at auditory again. If they are somebody who is overstimulated by noise, it becomes quite anxious or avoids places where there's lots of noise, we can look at the calming activities here. So something that might be helpful, or some things that might be helpful, are ear defenders, relaxing music if possible. I know that depends on your provision, but white noise, bubble wrap to pop, because it can really zone in on that sound, rainmakers, white noise. So I know some students with sensory needs at some schools are allowed, I know we are here allowed to carry a device where they can listen to music, but that's within their personal learning plan. Again, if there was a student who was the opposite, hyposensitive, so they didn't get enough stimulation or input from the auditory, some things we could do is these alerting activities below the auditory, little symbol there. So for example, provide higher kind of volume things that will stimulate them, like musical kind of rattles or instruments or toys, whistles. Again, you'd have to take your classroom into consideration here. So it might be that if you do that in the main classroom, it's going to overstimulate other people. So they might need to come out and do that in a space away. You could also use foil blankets to shake or scrunch, upbeat, fast-paced music. So music again, but a different kind. And again, this we understand is not possible for 30 students in a busy mainstream classroom. But what this could be is for 1 or 2 students that are really struggling with the sensory systems and the sensory input, and how they deal with that. And this could be a tool for just 1 or 2 that is an add-on to all the things that you're doing at a universal level. And we also understand this might need adapting depending on your school setting and how that looks, because they all are so different. Just the last little bit we're going to come up to now, and then there'll be time for questions at the end, is about specialist support. So if you have done some of the things that we've talked about today, and there's plenty more out there to read up on in terms of what you can do from a teacher's perspective or a teaching assistant's perspective in schools, but if you have done the things we've talked about and the other things that you might read about, and it's still not having the desired effect, and the students' sensory needs are still impacting their ability to learn and socialise and do what they need to do to succeed, then it might be that you need to seek some form of specialist support. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the people that are really useful in that area. Do you want to go through that?
So obviously there's occupational therapists. So when OTs work with school, it tends to be for things like sensory needs, but also they can help assess them by using different tools, such as the sensory processing measure, which is just like a standardized assessment. They can help work with the class to adapt to the environment, and also provide the things like the ear defenders and headphones if they need to be. They can help the child and the adult learn about why they're having these sensory differences and how they can help themselves. Help to develop interoceptive awareness. So there's a really nice program we use at our school called the Interoception Curriculum by Kelly Marler. If anyone wants to look that up, that's quite good, and anyone can do it, and it can just be a quick check-in activity. Developing self-regulation techniques and help kids develop independence to be able to identify their own sensory needs where they can, and understand why they're doing the things they're doing and feeling the way that they do.
I think in terms of occupational therapy, I don't think probably in a lot of schools there's too much knowledge about the role of an occupational therapist in sensory differences. I don't know if you agree, but I think that occupational therapists are often associated with more motor skills, so cutting and other accessibility arrangements that involve motor skills and movement. But in terms of sensory differences, OTs, occupational therapists, have an absolutely massive role in working with sensory differences. In the school that me and Rachel are in, occupational therapists we work very close with them. Obviously you do. Yeah, you're an occupational therapist apprentice, and we'll work very, very close with them, and they are one of the first port of calls for our students when they have sensory needs. Every mainstream school should be able to have access to an occupational therapist through the local authority. So if you are wondering about how you can get in touch with an occupational therapist and put in a referral, speak to your school's SENCO or somebody else with that kind of knowledge, possibly a senior leadership team, depending on what your school format and teaching tree looks like. Last little one that we can think about is speech and language therapists. And you might be thinking, how does speech and language come into sensory differences? Do you want to have a go, or do you want me to talk this over?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually work with a speech and language therapist as well. So that can just help people like with the communication, and like I think people underestimate how important it is to be able to communicate how you're feeling. And speech and language therapists can help to like be able to bear with. So they might be able to help them participate in the conversations and discussions around the sensory needs. we can help to create visual supports. So, for example, at our school, we've got a lot of communication cards, and these are literally just, I think I've got some on me, but I don't actually know if you can see me. But basically, they're these little communication cards that are like probably like a credit card size, and you can have them on your keys, or you can give them to kids personally, and it just helps to, without using your verbal, because sometimes you're very overwhelmed and you can't actually speak anymore, and they're really helpful to still be able to communicate your needs. One thing that the speech and language therapists are really good at this school is psychoeducation around autism, ADHD,
Sensory processing.
Yeah, sensory processing within these things, and helping people to understand themselves, really. I think most of the speech and language therapists help with, for the kids to actually be able to understand and communicate on their own.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we talk about a lot here and at Witherslack Group, and specifically within speech and language, is the double empathy problem. And that's essentially saying that we often think of autistic people as maybe having differences in terms of their empathy, so not always having that understanding how other people think and act. But it's what we reflect on is actually it's a two-way street. I think often autistic people might struggle with empathy for people who are neurotypical and maybe not understand their ways of thinking and acting, but similarly, neurotypical people often struggle to understand and empathise with people who are autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. And then one thing that Rachel was just saying there, which is completely true, is that speech and language therapists are really good at helping young people understand their differences. And then within the capacity of this presentation, it can be sensory, but other differences as well, and how they relate and are different and similar to other people. I think as well, it's just worth mentioning in terms of speech and language therapy, that they essentially can help the student communicate their sensory needs, like Rachel was just saying, and they can in particular work with teachers and teaching staff and parents to help them help their children communicate, about their sensory needs, which is obviously really, really, really important. So where to look next? So just to round up, we've covered loads today. So thank you for being here with us and being very patient. A few resources that might be helpful. So supporting children with sensory differences in early years on the Leads for Learning website. That's where we've got a lot of our resources from today, and it's accessible to anyone in the public. It's brilliant. It says early years, and I do appreciate that a lot of you might not be from early years settings. You could even be from high school or college for all we know, but that it's still such important stuff. It goes back to basics in considering the environment that you're teaching in, the environment the students are learning in, and how that looks, how it feels, how it's going to be for students, for all students, and particularly those with sensory differences. So it's still worth having a look at, and them tables and resources we've talked about today are in there. Aldo Goes to Primary School is a really nice little story, and it just looks at and talks about the environment of classrooms and buildings and how that can affect students. The Body Keeps Score is a fantastic book, very Psychologist, so I love it. But it is all about trauma. It's about how trauma affects our body and our brain, and how it's all entwined, and how it does result in things like the sensory differences we've talked today. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and it'll give you a real understanding of what may be going on for some of your students in the classroom that may have experienced some adverse experiences. And lastly is beaconhouse.org.uk, their website. They are again trauma informed, and they do some absolutely fantastic work. Some of the training courses on Beacon House are brilliant, and they do a lot of discussion around trauma and how that can affect students in the classroom and in the wider environments. So I think that just about is us done talking. So we will, I think, go to Jodie, who's going to ask us some questions, I believe, from the panel.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. That was brilliant. We've had really good feedback in the chat box, and we've had quite a few questions submitted.
Yeah.
So our first question is, how can I support a 5-year-old who sensory seeks by head banging? We use a soft area and provide cushion and padding, but he continues to seek severe hitting against hard surfaces, not just when dysregulated. He also has a helmet. Do you have any advice?
Do you want to have a go?
I think that it's really good that using the soft surfaces with that, that could be potentially like proprioception. So it might be worth doing some like heavier stuff with him, maybe trying like the weight of blankets and things that might help. And if not, like if it does get quite bad, then that probably would be worth getting in touch with like an occupational therapist, because obviously we don't want him to like hurt himself. But it sounds like what you're doing already is really good.
Yeah, some of the stuff that you're putting into place already is fantastic. Like Rachel just said then, it could be head banging is serving a few different functions or one function that you're struggling to identify. But it could be just that is a kind of self-stimulating behaviour. But it also could be, again, like Rachel was saying, that it's another sensory system that looks like that's coming out as head banging. So it could be that there needs to be some work around the proprioceptive system, the movement system. And I know we give some examples. I'm just trying to find here, because I've got loads of notes. I'm just trying to find here the slides that we talked about the proprioceptive system, but it might be worth trying some of them things.
He does say things like heavy works, stretchy squeezy toys, and just stuff like that. And obviously try the weighted things as well, because that might really help.
Yeah. So yeah, lots of weighted things, incorporating lots of heavy work into the day. But if it does continue, definitely look at asking the school you're with to put in a referral to occupational therapy, because they would be able to do a really thorough assessment of what's going on for you there, why the child's engaged in them kind of behaviours, what function it's serving, and then they can suggest things to put into place about what you can do. But at the moment, it sounds like you're doing a fab job with the resources that you've got.
Oh, that was great, thank you. Our next question is, do you have any advice, please, for working with schools or settings who may be hesitant to or unable to adapt their sensory environment to the level needed by an individual learner?
Can you say that again for me, Jodie? Sorry, I've got sensory overload.
Yeah, that's fine. Do you have any advice, please, for working with schools or settings who may be hesitant or unable to adapt their sensory environment to the level needed by an individual learner?
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky one, and this is what I've referenced, I think, a couple of times throughout the presentation. I've obviously worked in, as I said at the beginning, mainstream schools for quite a few years, the massive schools, and I do appreciate the absolute difficulties of applying some of the things that we've talked about today into big mainstream settings. I think in terms for the individual learner, the biggest thing I can say is if you can get a sensory profile up and running, that is something that would be a real game changer. When I was working with a student in one of my old schools, he really was struggling with a lot of these types of things, and what we kind of did is collected it all onto a big piece of paper, a bit like that screenshot I put back a few slides ago, the sensory profile. And once we gathered a real whole round picture of the extent of the difficulties he was having, what kind he was responding well to, what he wasn't responding well to, and we could kind of show that to people who were able to implement them changes, they were much more willing, I think, because they could see it all and what was happening for him, and really get his input if possible in doing that. It's just information gathering. But I do understand it's difficult. And I think where possible, allowing just putting things in place that are little things. So for example, if a student needs to fidget, they might not be allowed bouncy balls in the classroom in a mainstream setting. I completely appreciate that. But what might be you could do is a little bit of blue tack. I used to give my students a little bit of blue tack. It's still regulation. It's not a banned item. It's not a big thing. They can mess with that. A student who might need to kind of leave a space if they're overwhelmed, they might not be able to walk around the whole school, but can they stand outside the classroom within eyesight for a few minutes? A student who needs that movement, maybe they could be the designated person in the classroom that's taking the books back to the cabinet and handing out the glue sticks and handing out the worksheets. It's about identifying them individual students with needs, and it's really difficult if you've got a school who's quite not able to facilitate them changes that need to happen in terms of the sensory environment. But if you can do the little things that are still within your remit but are kind of maximising on what you can do for them sensory needs, then that's already a fantastic start. And if the sensory needs really are of concern and they're growing and growing and growing, again, look at, you've done all you can and the school's struggling to do all else, look at them external referrals, because there are support for students who are struggling with mainstream schooling in conjunction with the sensory needs.
Thank you for answering that one. We
No
have
worries.
some more questions. Our next question is, we have a lot of PICA and self-harm related sensory seekers here. Can you suggest some safe alternatives to try instead of harmful objects, please?
I mean, I can give a few suggestions. I think the best thing you could probably do is, do we have a resource book? Where do we get our resources from, that?
And so there is like websites that you can access about like safe, like self-harm. Let me just
Mind is one. I think Mind,
Mind has some really good resources. Also Papyrus, I think.
Yeah, Mind and Papyrus are really good websites which have booklets on these kind of things with suggestions of kind of input that emulates maybe a feeling of deep pressure for replacing self-harm behaviour. I think the biggest thing about self-harm is it would really just depend on what the function of that self-harm is. That's what we would say about self-harm. So if self-harm is saving the function because that person is not getting enough deep pressure, absolutely the things that they could kind of do would be, they've sometimes suggested like ice on the skin. That's a really good one because it's kind of a cold sharp shock and it does almost emulate pressure.
Also rubber bands. I know when I used to work at the psychiatric hospital, quite often we would give the kids rubber bands and it would help, but obviously if it is quite bad, then that is when you get in touch with like CAMHS and stuff for like specialist support. But there is websites like Chloe said, like Mind, Papyrus. They have resources and booklets on there which are good, but I think things like ice, rubber bands, even it doesn't have to be something hitting against the skin, anything that stimulates that deep pressure. So it could be a really, within professional remit, if it's allowed in your school, a deep hug. Some schools are allowed to hug, deep hug, that pressure could work. It could be a weighted blanket. They might not necessarily need it on the arm or the leg or wherever they're cutting. It might just be an overall need for deep pressure. So a weighted blanket might work, or something where they're squishing and squeezing, that sensation of movement. And it will be very much trial and error. They might need to try different things, but do look out for finding things that kind of give that feeling of deep pressure and trial and error them. And again, use them websites like mine and Young Minds is the website I was trying to think of.
Young Minds, but also Mind and Papyrus are great too. The other thing I would just say is really check out the function of that, the function of self-harm, and that maybe not within your remit, but there will be mental health professionals who can help do that, because the function of the self-harm might not have anything to do with the need for deep pressure. It might be, for example, a means to seek connection with other people, or it might be a way of showing emotional pain, articulating what they're feeling in non-verbal ways. And if that is the case, a sensory kind of strategy isn't going to resolve the self-harm. So it is worth speaking to professionals in mental health about that. But it's absolutely worth trying the sensory techniques like we've just talked, the deep pressure stuff, and then consulting the websites that we've mentioned.